they will likely lose, or they should lose their position at Tartus, which is a big naval base for them, and Latakia, which is an airbase that they've used throughout this conflict. And hopefully neither will be available to them after this new government comes in, goes through the transition and becomes the government of Syria.
Interesting that you are certain, almost certain, that they will lose those two military bases. But President Putin is offering perhaps even humanitarian use, strangely, of the airbase. Could that be persuasive at all to HTS?
So HTS, of course, doesn't have to honor, I think it was like a 45-year lease that the Assad regime had with the Russian government. They obviously overthrew the Assad regime, which was one of the biggest committers of human rights atrocities in our generation. So there is no requirement, and of course, Russia enabled them to do that. There's no requirement that the incoming government honor that lease.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we're joined by former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy. Mick is also a retired CIA paramilitary operations officer. He spent 20 years as both a commissioned and enlisted Marine. After leaving the Pentagon, he co-founded the Lobo Institute, which brings together veterans and the international community for humanitarian operations. Mick, great to see you on Frontline. Thank you very much for your time. We're going to draw on your extensive experience of Syria today, and the fall of Assad was addressed by the man who gave him sanctuary, President Putin, at his annual press conference. He said his downfall wasn't a defeat for Russia and that it didn't mean Russia hadn't met its goals in Syria. But what about the military bases? If Russia does lose them in Syria, that would at least be a very huge setback, wouldn't it, if not a defeat?
I believe so, yes, Kate. I think it's clear that it was a strategic defeat for Russia. They had a client state in Assad. They essentially kept that regime in place. You could go back 50 years if you want to, of course, include the father. And they lost that, and they had to whisk him out, with very little notice, and give him, what they're calling him some kind of sanctuary in Russia, when in fact Russia was largely responsible for keeping him in power and for most of the atrocities committed by the Assad regime to be able to remain in power were done by Russia and also, of course, Iran. So I think it's a very substantial defeat for them. They will likely lose their warm water port in the Mediterranean. I can't imagine why any opposition force would allow them to remain, particularly since it was Russia that was bombing them as of their march toward Damascus. It was Russian aircraft, military aircraft, that was attacking them, and of course has been attacking them for the 13 years of this civil war. So it's still to be determined, but I think they will likely lose, or they should lose their position at Tartus, which is a big naval base for them, and Latakia, which is an air base that they've used throughout this conflict. And hopefully neither will be available to them after this new government comes in, goes through the transition and becomes the government of Syria.
Interesting that you are certain, almost certain, that they will lose those two military bases. But President Putin is offering perhaps even humanitarian use, strangely, of the airbase. Could that be persuasive at all to HTS?
So HTS, of course, doesn't have to honor, I think it was like a 45-year lease that the Assad regime had with the Russian government. They obviously overthrew the Assad regime, which was one of the biggest committers of human rights atrocities in our generation. So there is no requirement, and of course, Russia enabled them to do that. There's no requirement that the incoming government honor that lease. I am optimistic, maybe too optimistic, that they'll lose those positions. I just cannot imagine an opposition who's now in charge that fought against the regime and Russia for 13 years, thinking they have a commitment to give them a warm water port and allow them access to their airbase. That's just, I just don't see how it happens. But stranger things have happened. But I do think that the humanitarian aid is very much needed in Syria, as it is in Lebanon. And like you mentioned in the intro, I'm involved in a lot of that. That can be done through the previous Russian portion of these bases, because Israel basically attacked a lot of the Syrian military assets in both Tartus and Latakia, and they have to be salvaged before they can use that part of the base. But the Russian part, to my understanding, wasn't So it's still open. So the humanitarian community shouldn't have to ask permission by Russia to get humanitarian aid into the people that need it in Syria. That should be something that the opposition, now the transitional government, can approve, and hopefully that'll start free flowing soon.
So they don't even need Russia to be involved to be able to go ahead with the humanitarian use of those bases.
You would hope they don't. I mean, they had a lease with uh, the Assad regime. The Assad regime fled. They've been toppled, and now they're in Russia. So I think the opposition, now transitional government, should be able to say, we're not honoring the lease. You were fighting us during the last 13 years, and we threw you out as much as we threw Assad out. I hope that would be their position.
So it's almost 2 weeks since the revolution, which toppled the Assad regime. Are the right steps being taken, in your view, to prevent any risk of it slipping back into civil war?
So we obviously saw the conference in Aqaba, Jordan, with many of the countries in the region. Who wasn't there, which I haven't heard a great explanation, was the Syrian people and their representatives. Perhaps that's because they're still organizing themselves, but the next conference will include them. I hope it does. They are saying the right things. And I think it's important not to be too pessimistic. Obviously, Jelani has tried to separate himself from international jihad groups and ideology into a more nationalistic one. He's saying the right things on inclusiveness, all Syrians being part of the government, the minority being protected, including the small minorities. And I think that is right. And we should, of course, give him credit for saying that. But ultimately, credit should come by actions. I mean, the Taliban, in the negotiations of our withdrawal, U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, were saying similar things. And obviously, they've done none of those. They've actually taken it back to a place that it was worse for human rights, particularly women's rights, than almost any time in their history. So it doesn't mean that HTS is going to go down the same road as the Taliban, but I think all the international community should request actions, vice just rhetoric.
And from what you know about HTS, do you think it is capable and willing genuinely to go from terrorist organization to credible governing body?
I'm skeptical. I mean, Jelani started basically as Al Qaeda in Iraq. He was then sent by Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, uh, to Syria to start Al Nusra, the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria. Many of his fighters are from Al Qaeda, many are from ISIS. He obviously wants to present an image that he's left that behind. He has fought them, so that's important to point out. But often jihadist groups fight each other. It doesn't mean they're not jihadist. It just means they're trying to fight for the same territory or people. But we don't know yet. He is saying the right things, but there's a lot of indications that from past history and just from his actions, he's essentially appointing people in government already without going through a process that allowed the Syrian people to choose their elected leaders and then appoint people that they felt are most competent. But right now, I think the international community should be willing to come in very strongly with humanitarian aid, reconstruction support, if the government goes to being all inclusive. If they don't, we're going to have essentially a current version of Syria, which is not Syria. We have sections of the country that are run by other non governmental groups, including the one the US works with, the SDF. And this is going to be the case throughout Syria if they don't actually include everyone. It's going to say segregated.
HTS is currently in the process of absorbing different military forces into a new Syrian army. What progress has been made, and does it look like it's working and it can work?
So there's two, of course, really important parts of trying to integrate the army. The first is every nation needs a military. They need to have their own defense, both for internal support during crises and as well as obviously protecting its own country. Right now, it's been decimated. Israel has probably took out about 80, almost 90% of their military capacity. Obviously, from their perspective, they didn't want any of those falling in the hands of a group they have not yet come to trust and obviously has jihadist links, as you already mentioned. But that needs to be rebuilt. The other part is you really want to integrate all of these armed groups that aren't necessarily part of the government because the government is just being formed. They need to be included. If they're not included, you're going to leave all these highly trained individuals who are very capable, like the SDF, without another means of support other than their current situation. And if we're going to have a full Syria, that should be something that's the aim should be to integrate the military eventually.
So that kind of brings me to my next question. Where does this all leave the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army and the opposing Syrian Democratic Forces backed by the US?
So it has been a challenge, for many years. When I was in the Pentagon, this was a challenge. We feel the U.S., particularly the Pentagon, feels that the partners that we have had in the SDF were directly, obviously, responsible for the defeat of ISIS. In fact, they did 90% of the fighting. Most of the U.S. military efforts is enabling, whether it's intelligence or advisory or air support or artillery support, but essentially combat support. The SDF did most of the fighting and obviously took most of the casualties, and they were successful. We need to remember that. The enduring defeat of ISIS, because ISIS could look at this whole event, toppling of the Assad regime, as an opportunity. The enduring defeat is going to be on SDF. So we need to ensure that we maintain our presence there, in my opinion. We have about 900 servicemen and women there from the U.S. But that could be challenged in an incoming Trump administration. But that's always a balance with Turkey, our NATO ally, who has a different view of our partner, obviously. And we need to balance that. I've always thought that one of our best arguments toward Turkey is it's always better to have the U.S. with who you perceive as a potential, or at least connected to a potential adversary of them, PKK, a designated terrorist group. It's better to have the U.S. with elements of the Kurdish factions because that would make it much less likely, particularly that those groups would do anything against Turkey, and they haven't. They haven't done. The SDF, for example. Often, which is not talked about when it comes to the SDF, is a large portion of them are Arabs. They talk about the leadership, YPG, the Kurdish part. Obviously, one of the reasons why they're so effective, they're really good fighters. But deliberately, the SDF does include a lot of Arabs. And it's not just a Kurdish force, although it's kind of like shorthanded a lot in the media that it's.
What do you think will happen, though, if the incoming Donald Trump as president does decide to withdraw US forces from Syria?
Well, that could do a couple things. It could, allow ISIS to potentially regain a foothold and try to reconstitute itself. SDF is very good, but they need these enablers. They don't have an air force. They don't have anything close to the level of intelligence collection capability that the United States and our allies have. And it doesn't have, quite frankly, the combat support network like we do, whether it's artillery of any sort. So that will be a challenge to them. Also, Turkey might look at it as an opportunity to start taking back terrain that they being the SDF currently occupy, which would, from their point of view, require them to go focus on that. Again, taking their eye off the ball of ISIS. So it has a lot of potential pitfalls. I can understand the U.S. and I've been one of them, and my son's one of them. That's been deployed. The U.S. military has been deployed for quite some time in conflict zones, but it's beneficial to U.S. national security, regional national security of Europe, our partners, our NATO partners, for the U.S. to have a forward presence. It does change the battlefield, for our partners for the better. So it may be tough to convince the isolationist parts of some of our political uh, factions back in the United States, but I still think there's a core of both parties that understands that this isn't just benevolency. It's also in our own interest to ensure, one, that there's not a massive exodus of Syrians that are going to head toward Europe again. We've all seen that already happen. Two, that ISIS doesn't reconstitute itself. And then when they do, start looking at external targets, which is likely going to be our partners and allies.
Interesting, given everything that you have said, when HTS says Syria's future will be decided by the Syrians, it doesn't seem like that's the case at all.
You would hope it would be. The Syrian people have gone through 5 decades of oppression, 13 years of a brutal civil war, hundreds of thousands killed, millions displaced, that they would want a stable government that focused more inward in the sense that they're looking at how to improve the lot of the Syrian people and less allowing other countries to come in, like Iran, for example, and use them as a launch point for their covert operations throughout the region. That's going to be tough. There's a lot of countries, including the U.S., so we do have a presence there, but also all the countries that neighbor it, Jordan, obviously Israel, Lebanon, they all have a stake, as well as Europe and all the countries in the Gulf countries. Everybody is going to play a part in the solution, so everybody is going to have some part of the say in how that will be. But ultimately, it should be the Syrian people that make that determination, and then the government should respond, react, and focus on the Syrian people themselves.
And the interim government is expected to be in place for 3 months, at which time it's hoped elections will be held. Do you think that's too long?
It would really come down to the experts to know how long it would be to hold an election in a war-torn country like Syria. That should be the case. If this is in some way an extended transition period, so the people become ingrained and the people just accept that those unelected, and then appointed people are the government, that looks like it was a backsliding from what HTS and Jelani specifically said was going to happen. So the international community should look at just how long it would take to hold a valid election and then really push for that to be the time.
So it is potentially reasonable to set that time scale.
It could be. I mean, holding international elections right after a civil war that was this devastating, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure there are people in the UN that focus on international elections and the validity of them. They could do an assessment and come up with a time frame that would be reasonable. Yes.
So HTS is being given the benefit of the doubt by the international community as things stand at the moment. Its leader, which is known by his his old name, which he's reassumed since about a week, Ahmed al-Sharaa, he's making all the right noises, as you said earlier. And he told the BBC that women will be allowed to access education, go to university. Syria would be welcoming all religions. When is it time to stop designating HTS, do you think, as a terrorist organization?
So one of the criteria should be all those things come to pass, right? Again, I'm not saying that HTS is the Taliban, but they were saying all those before, and now women aren't allowed any education. They aren't even allowed out of their house for the most part. That is not something that Syria traditionally has been. So hopefully the culture there is going to demand that women have equal rights to men and, of course, full access to educations, all the way up to include collegiate educations and one that leads toward a career. That should be one of the criteria for whether it's not just the U.S., of course. Many European countries have them designated as a terrorist group, as does the UN. So it should be a criteria like that. Put rhetoric is one thing, actions are another. Actions are what's going to count. And once this government is set up, it's chosen by the Syrian people. It meets the criteria that, at least for the U.S., that Secretary Blinken laid out: equal rights, protection of the minority, free access of humanitarian aid, no restrictions for any particular group. Do not become another client state of an external country that wants to use basically Syria to attack their enemies. And the last one, which hopefully will happen quickly, is the destruction of chemical and biological weapons, which we know they have. But if those are all met and there is a free and fair election, I think the international community should look potentially at delisting HTS. But the other question is, why does HTS need to still exist? Like maybe they should just, the ones that are elected go into the government, and the group itself could just disband. I mean, the purpose of their existence was to overthrow Assad, and that's complete.
Diplomatic approaches have been made towards Syria by the international community already. The European Union will intensify its direct engagement with the new rulers. What support needs to be provided by the international community?
So certainly, if we're going to ask for a free and fair election, there are certain costs and resources that need to go in to make sure that happens. So if we're going to require that, we should absolutely. Then we should put our money where our mouth is. The other is a massive effort to resettle Syrians that want to go home, and there, of course, are potentially millions. And they are, especially if you look at Lebanon, there's a lot of resources that go in from Lebanon, which is obviously in need too. So there should be an effort by the international community to allow Syrians to return home that want to. And then, of course, the reconstruction could take decades and decades, and I've seen up to $280 billion estimated to do so. So it is substantial. Obviously, that's not all going to happen at once, but the international community, I think, needs to support the free election of the next government. They need to help Syrians return home. And then, of course, the reconstruction and humanitarian effort needs to be fully funded. And that's at a time where there's a lot of crises around the world that aren't fully funded. I'd like to.
Indeed. And you've been to Syria many times in your career, and you're currently thinking of ways that your organisation might be able to provide humanitarian support. Can you tell me a little bit more about your time there, what you learnt about the country, and why what you did, if you can tell me, and why it's important to support it at this moment?
So yes, I've been to Syria multiple times over the last 30 years. Some of it obviously was in my capacity when I was at the CIA, so can't talk about that one. But I certainly did as when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. So one of the countries that I was responsible for was Syria, and I went out there quite a bit, as you would guess, to all the locations where the U.S. has a presence. So in the east with the SDF, and then also at Antan, which is a base on the border with Jordan. It's a challenging base for those that have to serve there, but it served a great purpose of protecting that area. And essentially, every time we even looked at downsizing, our partners in Jordan and Israel begged us to reconsider. So it's not just the individuals in the Pentagon that want the U.S. presence to remain in Syria. It's a lot of the partners in the region, whether they'll say it publicly or not, but they do view the U.S. presence there as stabilizing and enabling of the defeat of ISIS, the enduring defeat of ISIS, and to counterbalance, especially at the time, Iran's malign influence there, which has changed obviously substantially.
Do you think that the threat of ISIS re-establishing itself is actually very genuine and very something that should be taken extremely seriously?
So I don't want to overstate it, but for those that follow it closely, the level of attacks that ISIS has done has gone up substantially since last year. I've heard, I don't know for a fact, up to 300% more attacks than this time last year. It may be that this is something that they'll view as an opportunity. They see, even if they're not completely aligned, but former jihadist fighters of theirs in the group that has now taken Damascus. So we have to be cognizant of that. And if, certainly, if the U.S. withdraws, they are definitely going to view that as an opportunity. And if the SDF then gets embroiled in fights with, the Turkish-backed groups or Turkey themselves, that will, I mean, if you flip the map around, so to speak, to use military talk, and you were ISIS, you would look at all those things lining up and say, now is our opportunity. Now's our chance to start taking back terrain, taking back resources, potentially old fields, to fund their external endeavors. And then, of course, once they do that, they'll start looking at how to make good on their promises of external attacks.
And just to get your comments on something that was said by a leading defence analyst here in the UK regarding, just to go back to the Russian military bases, they suggested that the fate of those bases in Syria will be like a litmus test of the way world politics will lean in Syria. At the moment, the West is inclined to try to help HTS establish an Islamist pragmatic government. But what if Russia is allowed to still project influence from Syria via its military bases?
Well, that's a good point, Kate. That would be another data point. So if women, for example, the one we already talked about, don't get full rights and don't have the right to go to education, that's a data point that they're not being forthright with the international community. If Russia, the group that actually, I mean, Assad was close to defeat back in 2014. It was 2014-15 when the Russians really stepped in, and then they took Aleppo. So the idea that the Syrian people would want a Russian presence in a country that uh, they were very much a part of the oppression and the massive human rights violations against the Syrian people is just nonsensical. It means that the government of Syria, if they were to approve that, are not looking out for the best interests of Syria. That looks like something that was a deal that might benefit them, but not makes no sense when you look at the last 13 years. So I think that would be a data point that they're not going down the road that they claim they are.
As somebody who knows the Middle East very well, how important do you think the stability of Syria is for the wider stability of the Middle East?
Very much so. I mean, and it's not just the Middle East. Obviously, the Middle East had a big impact by the massive refugee problem out of Syria to avoid the civil war itself. But that also, it affected substantially Europe. I mean, not just in the sense of being able to absorb all these very needed refugees, but also change the political dynamic of Europe. I don't do politics in the U.S., so I'm certainly not going to start doing that in Europe. But I think I've learned, and I've talked to a lot of people who said it really had a major impact on politics in Europe. So it is very important for the stability of the Middle East, of the broader area to include Europe, our very close treated allies of the United States. So that should be in everybody's interest to help reconstruct the country, make it a place that they want to return, and one that will ensure its own stability, because it focuses on all the aspects of Syria and focuses on the Syrian people, vice the international regional conflicts that other countries like to propagate.
Mick Mulroy, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Great speaking to you, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.